Hey everybody, I'm going to respond to a piece of feedback today, and I'm responding to it because it's provocative. Really, that's all it's got going for it. So, first, it is a response to a video that I posted a while back. The video is called Famines Are Political in Origin, and basically, the point I was making here is that in the modern world, when there's famine, typically the country in which the famine occurs is still exporting food. It's not that the country's agricultural system and the land isn't producing enough calories. It's that the local people can't afford to buy that food for the price that the people who grow it can get by exporting it to someplace else. Basically, it's not a lack of calories, it's a lack of money that causes people to starve. And so the video is called Famines Are Political in Origin. To which Get Zim Reagan responds, in the next decades will be famines because of grand solar minimum. Read The Dark Winter, How the Sun Causing a 30-Year Cold Spell by John I. Casey. We can only dodge IT when we invade Africa. Okay, so first of all, you may like what I had to say in the beginning. Get some Reagan. Yes, mainstream climate science seems to underplay or downplay or outright deny the role that the sun plays in, global temperature. Without the sun, basically, we are a frozen ball in space, incapable of supporting life as we understand it, without extraordinary technological intervention. And the sun is variable. It has different cycles. Sometimes it is more active, sometimes it is less active. Sometimes these cycles overlap and you get really extreme periods of either solar activity or solar inactivity. And surely that does have profound impacts on climate. John L. Casey, his more recent book is about earthquakes and volcanic activity. And absolutely, volcanic activity has enormous impacts on climate. And in the mainstream sort of conversational struggle between people, advancing one scientific viewpoint over another, people tend to pick their science based on their political and their cultural affiliations. Even scientists, they have career considerations. If, you live in an environment where there's lots of funding available for, research about how human activity is causing climate change and no research funds available for how changes in solar activity are changing climate change, well, then, people are going to follow the money. And the climate debate is also a debate between centers of financial and political power. We have competing power factions, not only in the United States, but globally. And the fossil fuel industry and the defense industry are very big centers of power, but they're those are the paleo powers. The new centers of power that are rising are, Silicon Valley and its equivalent in China, basically the places that are developing AI, the places that are rolling out all of these new services based on big data and deep learning. The richest people in the world come from this sector. This is a new rising power sector. And, a narrative basically which blames the fossil fuel industry and old technology for climate change is going to be to the benefit of people who are, invested in and have controlling interests in new power technology and, information technology. It's a struggle. And, we are all, to one degree or another, useful idiots in this struggle. We are supporting, for the most part. I've studied science in the guise of the philosophy of science, so hypothesis formation and testing, paradigm changes, that sort of thing. That's my, vector into science. And I'm not, a mainstream Democrat. I'm not a liberal in the contemporary American sense. I'm basically, the libertarian who is liberal on social policy, social attitudes, and fairly conservative on financial things. Other things being equal. Like, I am less and less opposed to a universal basic income all the time. But I'm also seeing it as, a more and more financially conservative step It basically leaves the entire capitalist system in place, and it's basically just providing feedstock to would-be entrepreneurs. If you have, a country full of destitute people, you can't make nearly as much money, by creating a new company or a new product or a new service as you can in a country where people have money to spend. That's not rocket science or climate science. But I'm not interested in entering into the cultural debate about climate change and what causes it, because most everybody in it is arguing from a disingenuous position. They are practiced in arguments that they got from other people, champions of their side, and it's really cultural allegiance and political allegiance, which for the most part determine people's opinions about which scientific theories to take seriously and which ones to dismiss, denigrate, or demonize. I'm just not interested. I mean, the field is so full of disingenuous actors that it's very, very easy to get drawn into unhelpful debates that go nowhere and change nobody's minds, because most of the people are not there to find the truth. They are there to champion what they've already decided is the truth. So I'm not interested in that topic at all. But John L. Casey, I think it's an L, not an I, he does not advocate invading Africa. So this is something that you have attached to his, you say read his book. I haven't read his book. I've watched some of his interviews. I have read summaries of his books and summaries of a paper that he published in 2008 on his own website. He presents it as a scientific paper, peer-reviewed and, published in a scientific journal. It was not. When he comes on the Newsmax network, he's introduced as a leading climate scientist. He is not even a participant in formal, organized science, in the scientific community. He is a maverick. He is, somebody challenging the system from the outside. And, frequently in the history of science, challenges from the outside have upset lots of established apple carts and led to, paradigm changes. But much more likely is that the maverick, railing against the scientific consensus is wrong. That happens far more frequently than, the maverick coming in from the outside, upsetting apple carts, really, brings with him or her, most likely him, historically speaking, a new way of seeing things which guides science going forward. What I'm interested in is, you seem to be attached to this image of invading Africa, and I just would ask you to ask yourself a few questions. What would it take for the United States or the European Union or NATO to militarily invade, secure, and hold a continent? What resources would that require? And could those resources be directed elsewhere that would give us better results? So you say the only option is to invade Africa. That implies that you have compared different options. I'd be curious to know which ones you compared and found deficient in comparison to invading and holding an entire continent with military force. Have you considered what the Chinese are doing right now? The Chinese, they are expanding trade via their Belt and Road Initiative, but also they are opening Confucian centers in Africa. They are using their soft power to get African people to learn Chinese, to study Chinese culture, and to become basically just friendly, to have just an affinity for Chinese culture. They've been doing it for a while. Let me read something from the Council on Foreign Relations. And I know if you're paranoid that just CFR is it's basically 666, it's the devil, it's the Bilderbergers, but it is a real organization and they do real research. So this is a post from last summer, July 20th, 2017. And it's from the Council on Foreign Relations, so you can find them at cfr.org. From Africa in Transition, which is their series, Chinese Soft Power in Africa. by John Campbell. It starts, Western media coverage of Chinese initiatives in Africa focuses on trade and investment, resource extraction, the presence of Chinese boots on the ground, especially with respect to the UN peacekeepers, and diplomatic interchange between Beijing and African capitals. However, perhaps we should be paying more attention to China's growing use of soft power in Africa, especially educational and technological transfer initiatives. Quartz reports that there are now 20 Chinese-run agricultural training centers in Africa and over 40 Confucius centers, which are Chinese language and culture schools. The Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs has announced that China will offer 10,000 scholarships to African officials over the next decade. More Africans from English-speaking countries now study in China than in the United States or the United Kingdom. So, what do you think of the Chinese approach there to Africa? Do you think it's going to bear more or less fruit than preparing for an all-out military invasion? And what's your plan, for holding on to the territory once it's been secured by military means? Are you going to kill off Africans? I mean, if it's a cultural, racial, national contest to seize productive, fertile agricultural grounds, even if you invade militarily, the people who already live there still need to eat. So are you going to let them starve to death while you export the food back to the nations that you think are more deserving? Are you going to, take the initiative, proactively eliminate the native population? What's the plan? I'm curious about that. Also, other options. Have you considered perhaps different ways to produce food without invading Africa? Is it conceivable that we could boost agricultural yields using new techniques, new technology, even in a period of diminished solar activity? Is it more or less likely? Is that approach more or less favorable or auspicious than all-out military invasion of an entire continent? Now, I get what you mean when you say invade Africa. You probably mean seize the most productive agricultural areas in Africa. Places that are largely desert, places that are, possibly too cold because they're too far south. Yeah, we're not interested, right? So maybe I'm being hyperbolic when I say, militarily seize and occupy an entire continent, because that sounds ridiculous. But honestly, what you've suggested to me does sound ridiculous. But I will admit that I am playing up the ridiculousness of it, with my phrasing. So here's another possibility, something that, regardless of whether the temperature is too low or too high, it's always a topic of conversation: geoengineering. In a cooling climate, are there geoengineering techniques that we could use to increase the temperature? Perhaps deliberately releasing methane from frozen, permafrost? Have you considered it? And how about this? I mean, my point in that video that you're responding to is that the people who starve today don't starve because, the place where they live doesn't produce enough food. They starve because they don't have enough money to buy that food. That food gets exported to places where it gets sold at a higher price. In a globally cooling environment, is that going to change? Do we really need to invade Africa in order to get food from Africa? Or will, as they do now and as they have in the past, African governments sell food, export food, when their own people don't have enough to eat? What's a better use of our resources in the moment? Preparing to invade an entire continent and possibly exterminate its inhabitants? Or continue to produce wealth, secure in the knowledge that when food becomes short, it will be for sale to the highest bidder? That there's a long history of African nations selling food abroad when their own people are starving. Why would that change in the future? Why do you think? What is your attachment to a military solution to the problem of global cooling and decreased agricultural yields? I'd really like to know. Because to me, and I've said this in other videos, I am not one to scream racism at every little thing. I think that's one of the most unhelpful habits, intellectual, rhetorical habits of the current political moment. But it really does seem, I mean, if the solution that you leap to is to invade Africa, to take control of their agricultural lands and deny that food by force to the people who live there, so that it can be sent to the places that you would rather see survive, it kind of smacks of racism, dude, So really, I mean, I'm sort of speaking rhetorically because comments like this, I've found in the past that when I ask for clarification, when I extend a polite and friendly invitation to, tighten up your thinking perhaps, or expand on your thinking, these sorts of invitations typically go unanswered. But I'm hoping I'm wrong. Please, tell me more. All right, that is all for this episode. I think Colin is on vacation or something, but there will be no Gen X former libertarian versus Gen whatever, current libertarian video this week. Talk to you tomorrow.